Welcome, everyone, to IDDI's On Demand podcast series. Today's session is focusing on an innovative statistical methodology called Generalized Pairwise Comparisons, or GPC, which is bringing a new approach for the design and analysis of clinical trials. This methodology allows for the use of multiple endpoints in a single analysis, ultimately addressing specific needs of patient-centric medicine. Joining us to discuss further is Jean-Christophe Chiem, Senior Statistical Scientist at IDDI. Hello, Jean-Christophe, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, Eric. It's a real pleasure to meet you today.
Excellent. And so, Jean-Christophe, I guess you're also known as JC, so I'll call you that moving forward here.
Perfect.
So, JC, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your position at IDDI?
Yes, of course, Eric. I'm initially an engineer in applied mathematics by training. I worked as a consultant for 2 years before completing a PhD in public health. My thesis investigated how computer models could help patients and clinical stakeholders to improve complex decisions in public health. I then joined IDDI in 2015 and worked as a biostat, especially performing statistical reporting for scientific committee, monitoring the safety of patients undergoing clinical trials. 4 years ago, I have had the opportunity to join a research team dedicated to the development of an innovative methodology called Generalized Pairwise Comparisons that we abbreviate GPC.
Okay. And as part of the research team at IDDI, can you share a little bit more about what this encompasses?
Well, since I was a young boy, I was always attracted by research, and after my PhD, I chose to join IDDI as well. The daily work is grounded into science. We are a team of very talented and enthusiastic researchers. We often need to admit the limits of our individual knowledge, but the team is always dedicated to bring the finest, cutting-edge solutions to issues we face in statistics related to clinical trials.
Okay. And today's topic is dealing with this innovative methodology called Generalized Pairwise Comparisons, or more simply GPC. So, could you share more background of how this methodology was developed?
This methodology has been developed in 2010 by Mark Boyce, the founder of IDDI. The principle of this method is actually quite intuitive. Say that you want to compare two arms of a randomized control trials. What we do with generalized pairwise comparison is to compare each patient under the treatment arm with each patient under the control arm. We can then compute the measure that is called the net treatment benefit that reflects the difference between the probability that a patient performs better under the treatment and the probability that a patient performs better under the control. What is interesting with this intuitive methodology is that rules to compare patients can be arbitrarily complex. Especially, a rule can take into account the effect of multiple endpoints. It's interesting to note that at the era of large data collection, statistical analyses submitted for approval are more often than not conditioned by the statistical significance of only one endpoint. But usually, patients, clinicians, and investigators, they are interested in multiple facets of the working of a drug. Say, for example, that you are interested in whether a drug is efficient, safe, and whether it preserves quality of life of the patient in this order. GPC allows you to compare patients using this prioritization of endpoint. If you can rule out that there is an efficacy of the treatment as a first endpoint for a pair of patients, then this is 1 point for this corresponding treatment. Sometimes there is no clinical meaningful difference on this first endpoint of efficacy. And in this case, we are going to compare patients based on the secondary endpoint of safety. If this is feasible, then this is 1 point for the corresponding treatment. Again, if a comparison is not feasible, then we look at the third endpoint of quality of life. It's interesting that doing so, we are actually making sense of the whole set of data of efficacy, safety, and quality of life in one same measurement of the net treatment benefit. In addition, this method of prioritization controls naturally for correlations between the endpoint. As if there is a win counted at one level, then it is not counted like a twice effect on another level. We can also vary the threshold of clinical relevance to evaluate an actual difference for the endpoint. And what also comes to mind with this idea of prioritization is that this prioritization may not be relevant for all investigator, clinicians, and other sets of priority can make better sense in some context. And so you can test the sensitivity of the results by changing these sets of priority. There has been a lot of research for the last decade to clarify the operational characteristics of GPC, and we do have a large bibliography available.
Excellent. And from what I understand, this is really a novel statistical methodology. There isn't another competing method for this. Is that correct?
Well, there are other methods based on parametric multivariate analysis, but these parametric analyses, they usually come with different assumptions, which are not necessarily easy to verify. And there is another non-parametric statistics that is called the win ratio. It's really close from the net treatment benefit that we use. And where the net treatment benefit that we define is a difference in proportion, the win ratio is a ratio. However, the win ratio does not account for the number of pairs of patients who could not be classified at all in the algorithm of comparisons. So in this sense, it creates a bias. Um, this bias can be easily controlled to include a discount of ties, and it leads to another metric that is called the win odds. The win ratio statistic has been much used in the evaluation of cardiological studies to compare the competing occurrence of severe rare heart events. It gained much traction by the agencies such as FDA, and these agencies are now really acquainted with this methodology of the win ratio.
Okay. And, in order to analyze the clinical trial data using GPC, are there any specific types of data that can be utilized?
The context in which we validated GPC is based on data collected under randomized control trial. As GPC is based on the one-on-one comparisons of patients, the randomization process allows stating that initial differences between patients are averaged out, and the effect we measure is not due only to chance, but it can be attributed to the treatment.
Okay. And what are some of the key benefits clients of IDDI have realized using this particular methodology? Are there any case studies that you can share with our audience?
Well, as you know, Eric, clinical trials cost much money, and they can take a long time. Um, they are taking energy from the investigator, and we should not forget that we are exposing patients to a new drug, and this is always a risk. So therefore, it can be frustrating that if a drug has an actual effect on multiple endpoints, the corresponding statistical analysis can only focus on a single endpoint. With GPC, we are able to capture the multidimensional effect of a drug if it is present within one statistically sound measure. We had the opportunity to work for a client who had a trial which actually failed to reach initially its the significance of its primary endpoint, and in this case, the primary endpoint was to limit the occurrence of severe adverse events. And we assessed the trial data that were publicly available, and we found out that simple statistics could actually show already that there was indeed a significance on the primary endpoint. But doing so, we actually worked with the sponsor to reinvestigate the full set of data and to find out that the initial results were indeed not only significant of the primary endpoint of limiting occurrence of severe adverse events, but also it limited the duration of these adverse events, and it delayed the onset of these events. You can imagine that the benefit for the patient based on all these endpoints is better suited than only the limiting of occurrences alone. So this GPC analysis to capture rigorously the multidimensional benefit of this drug, it has been filed for a drug approval submission to FDA. So that was for analysis of data after the completion of a clinical trials. Besides this, we do also have clients who contact us to perform design of clinical trials based on GPC. And so the question of design is to determine the correct sample size for a trial. In this case, the use of GPC can be particularly interesting, for example, for rare disease, as there are less patients available to enter the trials, and symptoms of this rare disease can be multiple, and you may have drugs which cover more than one of these symptoms. In other settings, the method of GPC can be a true asset to model and account for the correlation between the endpoints. With the flexibility of GPC and the tools we developed, you can literally draw survival curves, and you can find these curves in the literature, and you can also work with the clinician to elicit the experience they have with the drug and with the disease to inform design that are best suited to the clinical reality of the disease. So with this approach, for one specific trial, we were able to divide the required sample size of the trial by 15. So we came from 3,000 patients required down to 250. So that's real a huge advantage, and it actually make simply the trial feasible in this particular setting.
That's fantastic. And one of the key questions I know a lot of our listeners will have is, ongoing discussions with the regulatory agencies, FDA, EMA. How have they reacted to this methodology?
So since the beginning, we have been discussing a lot with FDA and EMA representative and other authorities in Belgium and elsewhere, and they are well aware already of this type of methodology to handle composites endpoints. The win ratio is one example, and these agencies, they are really in demand of this type of methodology. And we do have the advantage that we provide a very rigorous methodology, and we do have designs and approvals under submission with these authorities. They do not have question regarding the statistical validity of the method, and the discussion that we have are really encouraging, actually.
That's exciting. And getting back to the main beginning of the podcast, we mentioned, paving the way for patient-centric medicine. So I was wondering if you can share more insights into how this methodology actually involves patients themselves, and if you can share a little bit more about, the software that's being developed, how that will empower patients more in their, specific treatments.
Thank you for this question, Eric. As you understand, one of the core input of GPC, as we presented it, is one set of prioritized endpoint. For the previous example that I described, for example, designs and approval, we need to focus on one pre-specified set of priority. However, once the data have been collected and the drug is approved, the data of the randomized controlled trials can be reanalyzed using other priority sets. And this is where we are convinced that GPC, and more precisely the set of prioritized endpoint, can be customized to represent the patient's preference. For example, one typical set of prioritization could privilege survival over limiting toxicity. However, what if a patient facing a difficult decision, for example, decides to limit toxicity which can be unbearable for certain disease? And then he can privilege the absence of toxicity over survivors. And we can reanalyze the data to reflect this set of priority, meaning these preferences. And these preferences used with GPC on the collected data can potentially lead to different choice of a therapy. In addition, further discussion can assess what is the clinical difference that is valid for the patient. If a patient is to undergo toxicity with the treatment, maybe he has the right to choose how long is accept he accepts to live under this toxicity, and what is the gain he wants to achieve with this toxicity. So we developed a software with a graphical interface to facilitate this discussion between patients and clinicians, to inform the patients about the definitions of the endpoints, to formulate their preference into a set of priority. And this software can be used to run this set of priority within a GPC model, to have the computation in real time, and to compute an objective measure to advise the corresponding adequate treatment that corresponds best to this set of preferences. We are actually currently testing this approach. We have the opportunity to collaborate in a project led by the University of Bocconi, where our software implementing GPC will be tested with patient advocate. The solution will be used to elicit preferences related to breast cancer treatment, and how it can possibly translate to into a therapeutic decision. This shared decision-making tool can truly improve the adherence to the treatment for the patient, and lower possible regret also linked to the decision that were possibly misunderstood.
Well, excellent, JC. That's really a exciting development, and I'm looking forward to see more of this in the future here. And well, I think we're at the time limit for our today's podcast. So with that, I would like to thank you, JC, for your inputs here, and thanks to everyone joining us for today's session of IDDI's On Demand podcast. If you have any specific questions or topics that you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please contact us via info@iddi.com. So I guess we'll wrap it up here. So stay tuned for the next podcast from IDDI, and bye for now.
Thank you.